Most people believe that the Second World War started on September 1st, 1939, when German tanks rolled across the Polish border. And technically, that is when the shooting started, but the war itself, the machinery of it, the anger behind it, the economic desperation that fueled it, the political cowardice that enabled it, all of that was set in motion decades earlier. You see, wars do not simply erupt from nowhere. They're built piece by piece, decision by decision, over years and sometimes generations. And the Second World War, the deadliest conflict in human history, was no exception. It was assembled like a bomb, one component at a time, by politicians, bankers, generals, and diplomats who either didn't understand what they were building or simply didn't care. So if you really want to understand why 50 million people died between 1939 and 1945, you need to rewind the clock much further than 1939. You need to go back to the end of the First World War. You need to go back to a single document signed in a single room inside a single palace. Because the true origin of the Second World War was written in ink long before it was written in blood. Let's go back to June 28th, 1919. The setting is the Hall of Mirrors at the Palace of Versailles, just outside Paris. It's an enormous room, gilded and glittering, built to project French power and grandeur. And on this particular day, it's packed with diplomats, politicians, and military officers from across Europe and beyond. They're gathered to sign the Treaty of Versailles, the document that would formally end the First World War. Now, on the surface, the treaty was supposed to bring peace. It was supposed to settle the devastation left behind by 4 years of industrialized slaughter. The war had killed roughly 17 million people, soldiers and civilians alike. It had obliterated entire landscapes. It had toppled empires. The Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Ottoman Empire, the Russian Empire, and the German Empire had all collapsed. Europe was shattered, and its leaders were desperate to make sure nothing like this ever happened again. But here is where the story becomes more complicated. The men who wrote the Treaty of Versailles weren't really interested in lasting peace. They were interested in punishment, and the country they wanted to punish most of all was Germany. You see, the treaty included a provision called Article 231, and it would go on to become one of the most consequential sentences in modern history. It read, in essence, that Germany and her allies accepted full responsibility for causing the war. This was more than a diplomatic formality. It amounted to a moral verdict. It branded an entire nation as guilty. The German delegation was not allowed to negotiate. They were not allowed to amend. They were told to sign or face the continuation of a naval blockade that was already starving German civilians. They signed. And in doing so, they lit a fuse that would burn for 20 years. The terms of the treaty were severe in ways that went far beyond a simple admission of guilt. Germany was forced to surrender 13% of its European territory, more than 27,000 square miles of land, and roughly 1/10 of its entire population. Somewhere between 6.5 and 7 million people suddenly found themselves living outside of German borders. Alsace-Lorraine was returned to France after nearly 5 decades of German control. Parts of West Prussia and Silesia were handed over to the newly created state of Poland, effectively cutting East Prussia off from the rest of Germany through what became known as the Polish Corridor. The heavily industrialized Saar Basin, rich in coal, was placed under the administration of the League of Nations for 15 years, with its economic output diverted to France. Northern Schleswig went to Denmark. Belgium received Eupen and Malmedy. The port city of Danzig, overwhelmingly German in population, was made a so-called free city under international supervision. And beyond Europe, Germany lost every single one of its overseas colonies, territories spanning over 4.5 million square kilometers across Africa, Asia, and the Pacific, all redistributed among the victorious Allied powers, primarily Britain and France. But those territorial losses were only the beginning. The treaty also imposed catastrophic military restrictions on Germany. The once mighty German army was reduced to a maximum of 100,000 soldiers. The navy was slashed to a skeleton force. Germany was forbidden from possessing an air force altogether. Tanks, heavy artillery, and submarines were all banned. The Rhineland, the stretch of territory along Germany's western border with France, was declared a permanent demilitarized zone. No German soldiers, no fortifications, no weapons of any kind were permitted there. In effect, Germany's western flank was left completely exposed and defenseless. Then came the question of reparations. In 1921, a reparations commission assessed the total damages caused by Germany during the war and arrived at a staggering figure of $33 billion. A sum so vast that economists at the time openly declared it would be impossible to collect without destabilizing the entire global financial system. Germany was expected to pay this in gold-backed currency, hard cash, raw materials, merchant ships, coal, livestock, and industrial goods. The payments were structured to continue for decades. Germany owed not just money, but its economic future. Now imagine how all of this appeared from inside Germany. You've just fought a brutal war. Millions of your young men are dead or maimed. Your economy is wrecked. Your emperor has abdicated and fled to the Netherlands. You're governed by a fragile new democracy called the Weimar Republic, a government that many Germans never asked for and many more actively despised. And then you're told that the entire war was your fault, that you must hand over your land, your colonies, your coal, your ships, your army, and your money. And the people telling you this won't let you negotiate, they won't let you argue, they won't even let you sit at the table. You either sign or you starve. The psychological impact of this on the German population cannot be overstated. The treaty didn't just weaken Germany materially, it humiliated the nation at its core. Germans called it the Diktat, a dictated peace, not a negotiated one. Many Germans genuinely believed they hadn't lost the war on the battlefield. The armistice had come while German troops were still on foreign soil. This gave rise to the so-called stab-in-the-back myth, the idea that Germany's army had been betrayed from within by politicians, communists, and others who had surrendered prematurely. It was a conspiracy theory, but an extraordinarily powerful one. And it would be exploited ruthlessly in the years to come. The Weimar Republic, Germany's fragile post-war democracy, now found itself in an almost impossible position. It was born out of defeat, associated with surrender, and saddled with an economy that was collapsing under the weight of reparations, debt, and lost industrial capacity. The government's response to its mounting financial obligations was to print money, vast amounts of it. You see, Germany needed to pay its reparations in gold or foreign currency, but it didn't have nearly enough of either. So the Reichsbank, Germany's central bank, began running the printing presses at an unprecedented pace, flooding the economy with paper marks that were backed by nothing. At first, the effects were manageable. Prices rose, but slowly. Wages adjusted, more or less. But soon, the process began accelerating dramatically. In January of 1923, $1 was worth approximately 17,000 German marks. That was already a terrible exchange rate, but it was about to get much, much worse. By June, the dollar was worth 192,000 marks. By October, it was worth 170 billion marks. And by November of 1923, one single American dollar was worth 4.2 trillion German marks. Consider that number for a moment. 4.2 trillion. What did this mean in everyday life? Economic chaos. Workers were paid twice a day because their wages would lose half their value between morning and evening. People carried wheelbarrows full of banknotes just to buy a loaf of bread. Savings accounts that had taken entire lifetimes to build were wiped out overnight. A pensioner who had carefully saved the equivalent of a comfortable retirement suddenly found that their entire life savings couldn't buy a single postage stamp. Restaurants stopped printing prices on their menus because the numbers changed by the hour. Some businesses simply stopped accepting cash altogether. People burned banknotes for heating because the paper was literally worth more as fuel than as currency. Germany's social fabric began to unravel. The middle class, the backbone of any stable democracy, was essentially annihilated. Professionals, teachers, civil servants, small business owners, all the people who had played by the rules, saved their money, and trusted their institutions were now destitute. And this is critical to understand because it wasn't the very poor or the very rich who became radicalized, it was the middle class. People who had something to lose and then lost everything and who were now desperate for someone to blame and someone to follow. It was during this exact period, in November 1923, that a relatively unknown political agitator named Adolf Hitler attempted his first grab for power. He and a few hundred followers stormed a beer hall in Munich trying to launch a coup against the Bavarian state government. The attempted coup was amateurish and chaotic, and it collapsed within hours. Hitler was arrested, tried, and sentenced to 5 years in prison, though he served less than 9 months. During his time in Landsberg prison, he dictated a book outlining his political ideology. His burning resentment of the Treaty of Versailles, his paranoid theories about who was to blame for Germany's humiliation, and his apocalyptic vision for Germany's future. The book was called Mein Kampf, and in it, the blueprint for everything that would follow was laid bare for anyone who cared to read it. At the time, however, very few people paid serious attention. At this stage, history could still have taken a different path. In 1924, the hyperinflation crisis was brought under control with the introduction of a new currency called the Rentenmark. In that same year, something called the Dawes Plan was introduced, named after American banker Charles Dawes, who chaired the committee that designed it. The plan was supposed to stabilize Germany's economy and get reparations payments flowing again. The mechanism worked like this. The plan restructured Germany's reparation payments into more manageable annual installments, but more importantly, it opened the floodgates for massive American loans to pour into Germany. Over the next several years, American banks and financial institutions loaned Germany the equivalent of billions of dollars. Wall Street firms like J.P. Morgan and Company Dillon Red and the National City Bank floated enormous bond issues to finance German industry. The money flowed into chemical conglomerates like IG Farben, steel giants like Vereinigte Stahlwerke, and a host of other industrial enterprises. On the surface, this looked like a rescue mission. And in many ways, it worked. Germany's economy stabilized, industrial production climbed, unemployment fell, cultural life flourished. The years between roughly 1924 and 1929 became known as the Golden Twenties. Berlin became one of the most vibrant cities in Europe, a center of art, cinema, music, and intellectual life. For a time, the Weimar Republic appeared to be stabilizing. Democracy, it seemed, might actually take root in German soil. But there was a fatal flaw buried inside this apparent recovery, and it was structural. Germany's economic revival was almost entirely dependent on the continued flow of American capital. The loans weren't building a self-sustaining economy, they were building a house of cards. German businesses and local governments were borrowing heavily from American banks to fund their operations, and they were using a portion of those borrowed funds to make their reparations payments to France and Britain. France and Britain, in turn, were using those reparations payments to repay their own war debts to the United States. In effect, the money was moving in a circle. American banks lent money to Germany, Germany paid France and Britain paid the money back to American banks. And the whole cycle repeated. Everyone was borrowing, nobody was building anything that could survive without the continued flow of credit. And if American capital ever stopped flowing, the entire structure would collapse. In 1929, the collapsed spectacularly. On October 24th, 1929, the New York Stock Exchange began a catastrophic crash that would wipe out billions of dollars in wealth within a matter of days. The crash triggered a cascading series of bank failures, business closures, and economic contractions that would become known as the Great Depression, the worst economic crisis in modern history. Within the United States, the consequences were devastating. By 1933, roughly 15 million Americans, more than 20% of the working population, were unemployed. But the impact on Germany was even more severe. Desperate for cash, American banks immediately began recalling their short-term loans from Europe. For Germany, which had become utterly dependent on those loans, this was an economic death blow. The apparent golden era disappeared with astonishing speed. Banks collapsed, factories closed, businesses folded. By the end of 1929, around 1.5 million Germans were out of work. By the end of 1930, that number had more than doubled to nearly 4 million. And by early 1933, a staggering 6 million Germans, roughly 30% of the entire workforce, were unemployed. In some industrial areas, unemployment reached even higher. Families were evicted from their homes. Soup kitchens stretched for blocks. Suicide spiked. The resulting despair was immense. And once again, it was the middle class that was hit hardest. The same people who had been destroyed by hyperinflation just a few years earlier and who had only barely recovered were now being destroyed all over again. This time, many of them had simply had enough. They had lost faith in the Weimar Republic. They had lost faith in capitalism. They had lost faith in democracy itself. And they were ready to follow anyone who promised to restore order, dignity, and national strength. This was precisely the political opening Adolf Hitler had been waiting for. His Nazi Party, which had been a marginal fringe group throughout the Golden Twenties, suddenly found a massive audience. In the 1928 elections, the Nazis had received just 2.6% of the national vote, a rounding error. But by September 1930, in the first election after the Depression hit, that figure exploded to 18.3%, making the Nazis the second largest party in Germany. By July 1932, they were the largest, commanding 37% of the vote. And on January 30th, 1933, Adolf Hitler was appointed Chancellor of Germany. Now, it's important to understand what happened here in economic terms. The very same financial system that had tried to stabilize Germany through the Dawes Plan had inadvertently created the conditions for its destruction. American capital had flowed into Germany, created artificial prosperity, built dependency, and then vanished, leaving behind an economic wasteland that became fertile ground for the most destructive political movement in modern history. This wasn't a conspiracy. It was something arguably worse. It was negligence on a civilizational scale. But Germany was not the only country where the interwar period was breeding future conflict. If we really want to understand the full scope of what led to the Second World War, we have to look east to Japan. Japan in the 1920s and 1930s was a nation in transition. It had industrialized rapidly over the preceding decades, becoming one of Asia's most powerful military and economic forces. Japan had fought alongside the Allies during the First World War and expected to be treated as an equal partner in the post-war order. Instead, Japan emerged from the settlement feeling deeply slighted. At the Paris Peace Conference, Japan's proposal for a racial equality clause in the League of Nations Charter was rejected by the Western powers. To many in Japan, the message seemed unmistakable. Japan was useful as a military ally, but it would not be accepted as a true equal by the Western colonial powers who dominated global affairs. The Great Depression hit Japan hard, particularly its rural economy. Silk exports, a major source of income for Japanese farmers, collapsed as American demand evaporated. Millions of rural families were pushed into poverty. Food shortages spread. The political establishment, seen as corrupt and ineffective, began losing control. And into this vacuum stepped the Japanese military, which had been growing increasingly powerful and nationalistic throughout the 1920s. On September 18, 1931, officers of Japan's Kwantung Army staged a false flag incident near the city of Mukden in the Chinese province of Manchuria. They detonated a small explosive charge on a section of the South Manchuria Railway, blamed the explosion on Chinese saboteurs, and used it as a pretext to launch a full-scale military invasion. Within months, the Japanese army had conquered the entire region, established a puppet state called Manchukuo, with a figurehead emperor controlled entirely by Tokyo. This was a blatant act of aggression against a fellow member of the League of Nations. China appealed to the League for help. The League responded by sending a commission of inquiry led by a British diplomat named Lord Lytton to investigate. The commission took over a year to issue its report, which concluded that Japan's actions were unjustified and called for the restoration of Chinese sovereignty over Manchuria. Japan's response was straightforward and devastating. It walked out of the League of Nations and continued its occupation. And here's the critical thing. The League of Nations did absolutely nothing to stop Japan. It had no army. It had no enforcement mechanism. The United States, the world's most powerful country, wasn't even a member. Britain and France, the League's two most influential members, were both mired in their own economic crises and had no appetite for a confrontation with Japan on the other side of the world. So the League issued its report, Japan ignored it, and the world moved on. This represented more than an ordinary diplomatic failure. It was a signal, a loud, clear signal to every aggressive, expansionist power on Earth that the international system designed to prevent war was in fact completely toothless. If Japan could invade a sovereign nation, defy the League of Nations, and suffer zero consequences, then why couldn't others do the same? Italy's Benito Mussolini was watching closely, and he took notes. Mussolini had been in power in Italy since 1922, ruling as a fascist dictator who dreamed of restoring the glory of the Roman Empire. He had his eyes on Ethiopia, one of the last independent nations in Africa, and one that had famously defeated an Italian invasion force back in 1896, a humiliation that still stung. In October of 1935, Mussolini launched his invasion. Ethiopian Emperor Haile Selassie appealed desperately to the League of Nations for help. He traveled to Geneva personally and delivered one of the most powerful speeches in diplomatic history, pleading with the assembled delegates to honor their commitments to collective security. The League imposed economic sanctions on Italy, but they were deliberately watered down. Oil, coal, and steel, the materials Italy actually needed to wage its war, were specifically excluded from the sanctions. Britain and France, terrified of pushing Mussolini into Hitler's arms, secretly negotiated the Hor-Laval Pact, a backroom deal that would have handed 2/3 of Ethiopia to Italy in exchange for peace. When the deal leaked to the press, it caused a scandal, but it revealed the ugly truth. The Western democracies were more interested in maintaining their alliances with the dictators than in upholding the principles they claimed to believe in. By May of 1936, Italian forces had captured Addis Ababa. Ethiopia was fully conquered. The League of Nations had failed again, and this time the failure was even more damaging than Manchuria, because it happened in full view of Europe, not on the other side of the world. Every dictator on the continent could see that the system built to prevent aggression was not just weak. It was willing to sacrifice smaller nations to appease larger ones. Meanwhile, back in Germany, Hitler was watching all of this unfold with the careful attention of a predator studying its environment, and he was methodically, systematically tearing apart the Treaty of Versailles. He had already pulled Germany out of the League of Nations in October of 1933. In 1935, he openly announced the reintroduction of conscription and the existence of a new German air force, the Luftwaffe, both in direct violation of the treaty. The response from Britain and France was remarkably muted. Britain even signed the Anglo-German Naval Agreement in June of 1935, allowing Germany to build a navy up to 35% the size of the Royal Navy. This agreement was made without consulting France, and it effectively legitimized Germany's violation of the Versailles military restrictions. The message to Hitler was unmistakable. The Western powers were willing to negotiate away the treaty's restrictions rather than enforce them. Then came March 7th, 1936. On that day, Hitler ordered German troops to march into the Rhineland, the demilitarized zone that had been established by the Treaty of Versailles as a buffer between Germany and France. This was an extraordinary gamble. The German army at this point was still relatively small and poorly equipped. Hitler himself later admitted that the 48 hours after the march into the Rhineland were the most nerve-wracking of his life. He had given his commanders orders to withdraw immediately if the French army responded with force, but France did nothing. The French government was paralyzed by indecision. It consulted with Britain, which counseled against any military response. The British position was essentially that Germany was merely walking into its own backyard. And so the moment passed. Hitler's gamble paid off spectacularly. Not only had he reclaimed the Rhineland without a fight, but he had demonstrated something far more important. He had shown that the Western democracies would not fight to defend the post-war order. They would protest. They would condemn. They would wring their hands. But they would not act. The result greatly strengthened Hitler's confidence. Each provocation that went unchallenged made the next one easier. Each line that was crossed without consequence made the next line seem less significant. And in this slow, incremental process of testing and escalation, Hitler refined the strategy that would carry him all the way to the brink of war. Now, running parallel to all of this was another conflict, one that is sometimes called the dress rehearsal for the Second World War. In July of 1936, a military coup led by General Francisco Franco attempted to overthrow Spain's democratically elected Republican government. The country split in half, and a brutal civil war erupted that would last nearly 3 years. What made the Spanish Civil War so significant for the broader trajectory toward World War was the international involvement. Hitler and Mussolini immediately threw their support behind Franco's nationalist forces, providing troops, aircraft, tanks, and ammunition. Germany's Condor Legion gained invaluable combat experience in Spain, testing tactics, equipment, and strategies that would be deployed on a much larger scale just a few years later. The destruction of the Basque town of Guernica in April of 1937 by German and Italian bombers became one of the most horrifying episodes of the conflict. A deliberate attack on a civilian population that foreshadowed the terror bombing campaigns of the coming World War. The Western democracies, meanwhile, adopted a policy of non-intervention, officially refusing to supply arms to either side. This policy was a fig leaf. Germany and Italy were openly supplying Franco, while Britain and France stood back. The Soviet Union provided some support to the Republican side, but it was inconsistent and came with strings attached. The Spanish Republic was effectively abandoned by the very democracies that should have been its natural allies. Spain became a laboratory for modern warfare, a proving ground for the weapons, tactics, and alliances that would define the Second World War. And it reinforced the pattern that had been established in Manchuria, Ethiopia, and the Rhineland. Aggression was rewarded. Inaction was the norm. And the institutions designed to prevent war were either unwilling or unable to function. By 1938, the pattern was set, and Hitler was ready for his boldest move yet. In March of that year, German troops marched into Austria in what became known as the Anschluss, the annexation of Austria into Greater Germany. And once again, the Western powers protested but took no action. Austria, a German-speaking nation with significant pro-Nazi sentiment, was absorbed into the Third Reich without a single shot being fired. Then came the Sudetenland crisis. The Sudetenland was a mountainous, industrialized region of western Czechoslovakia that was home to more than 3 million ethnic Germans. Hitler demanded that the territory be handed over to Germany, citing the supposed mistreatment of its German-speaking population. Czechoslovakia was a democracy, well armed and prepared to fight. It had a modern army, strong border fortifications, and mutual defense treaties with both France and the Soviet Union. But Czechoslovakia would never get the chance to defend itself. In September of 1938, British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain flew to Munich to negotiate directly with Hitler. He was joined by French Premier Édouard Daladier and Italian dictator Benito Mussolini. Czechoslovakia itself was excluded from the negotiations. The four powers reached an agreement on September 30th. Germany would be allowed to occupy the Sudetenland immediately. Czechoslovakia's objections were overruled. The country's border defenses, its industrial capacity, and its strategic position in Central Europe were all sacrificed on the altar of appeasement. Chamberlain flew back to London, waving a piece of paper and declaring that he had achieved peace for our time. He was cheered by crowds who were desperate to believe that war had been averted, but many observers remained unconvinced. Winston Churchill, then a backbench member of Parliament, delivered a searing verdict. He declared that Britain and France had been given a choice between dishonor and war, and that they had chosen dishonor. He warned that they would get war anyway. Churchill was right. Within 6 months, in March of 1939, German troops rolled into what remained of Czechoslovakia and occupied the entire country. The Munich Agreement, the pact that was supposed to guarantee peace, was torn up before the year was out. Hitler had never intended to honor it. It had simply been a tool to neutralize Czechoslovakia without having to fight for it. Now, at this point, something shifted in the calculations of the Western powers. The occupation of Czechoslovakia was different from everything that had come before. The Rhineland, Austria, and even the Sudetenland could be rationalized, however thinly, as Germany reclaiming territory that was ethnically or historically German. But the occupation of Czechoslovakia was the conquest of a foreign people. It was naked imperialism, and it finally shattered the illusion that Hitler's ambitions could be satisfied through negotiation. Britain and France issued guarantees to Poland, pledging to defend its independence if it were attacked. But by this time, the strategic situation had deteriorated catastrophically. The Rhineland was remilitarized. Austria was absorbed. Czechoslovakia was dismembered. The League of Nations was a hollow shell. And the Western democracies had spent the better part of a decade demonstrating that they would sacrifice smaller nations to avoid confrontation. Then came the final piece of the puzzle, the event that made the invasion of Poland not just likely, but inevitable. On August 23, 1939, Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union shocked the world by signing a non-aggression pact known as the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, named after the foreign ministers of the two countries. Publicly, the pact was a simple agreement not to attack each other, but secretly. It contained a protocol that divided Eastern Europe into German and Soviet spheres of influence. Poland was to be split between them. With the Soviet threat neutralized, Hitler was free to move. 9 days later, on September 1, 1939, the German Wehrmacht invaded Poland. Britain and France declared war on Germany 2 days later. The Second World War had now officially begun. But as we've seen, the war didn't start on September 1, 1939. That was simply the moment when the accumulated failures, resentments, and miscalculations of 20 years finally detonated. The real origins of the Second World War stretch back through the entire interwar period, through the appeasement of dictators, through the collapse of collective security, through the Great Depression and the artificial prosperity that preceded it, through the hyperinflation that destroyed a generation's savings, through the punitive reparations that crippled Germany's economy, and all the way back to a single document signed in a gilded room in Versailles. What makes this sequence of events especially haunting is how many opportunities existed to change its course. At almost every stage, the catastrophe was avoidable. If the Treaty of Versailles had been less punitive, Germany might not have been driven to such extremes of resentment. If the Dawes Plan had built genuine economic self-sufficiency instead of creating dependency on foreign loans, the Depression might not have hit Germany so devastatingly. If the League of Nations had confronted Japan over Manchuria, Mussolini might have thought twice about invading Ethiopia. If France had marched into the Rhineland in 1936, when it had overwhelming military superiority, Hitler's career might have ended then and there. If Britain and France had stood with Czechoslovakia in 1938 instead of surrendering it at Munich, the war might never have happened at all, but they didn't. At every turning point, the people with the power to prevent catastrophe chose the path of least resistance. They chose short-term comfort over long-term security. They chose appeasement over confrontation. They chose the illusion of peace over the reality of deterrence. And in doing so, they enabled the greatest catastrophe in human history. There is a deeper lesson embedded in this history, one that extends far beyond the specific events of the 1920s and 1930s. And that lesson is about the relationship between economic systems, political structures, and the conditions that make societies vulnerable to extremism. You see, every authoritarian movement in history has followed a similar pattern. First comes economic crisis, then comes social humiliation, then comes the search for scapegoats, and finally comes the strong man who promises to restore lost greatness. This pattern played out in Germany with devastating precision, but it also played out to varying degrees in Italy, Japan, and Spain. Economic despair, combined with a sense of national humiliation and a loss of faith in democratic institutions, created the conditions in which authoritarian leaders could rise to power and lead their nations into war. And the international financial system, far from preventing this, often made it worse. The cycle of loans, reparations, and debt repayments that defined the interwar economy created a fragile web of interdependence that transmitted economic shocks across borders with devastating speed. When Wall Street crashed in 1929, the reverberations didn't just damage the American economy, they destroyed the German economy, which was propping up the French and British economies, which were funding the American banking system. The whole thing was a closed loop, and when one link broke, the entire chain shattered. And this brings us to perhaps the most uncomfortable question of all: who was really responsible for the Second World War? The simplest answer is Adolf Hitler, and certainly without Hitler's particular brand of fanaticism, the war might have taken a very different form, or might not have happened at all. But Hitler did not rise or operate in a vacuum. He rose to power in a specific set of conditions that were created by specific decisions made by specific people, many of whom never intended the consequences that followed. The architects of the Treaty of Versailles created the resentment. The bankers who funded the Dawes Plan created the dependency. The politicians who failed to confront aggression in Manchuria, Ethiopia, and the Rhineland created the expectation that aggression would go unpunished. And the leaders who signed the Munich Agreement created the final illusion that war could be avoided by sacrificing the rights of smaller nations. The Second World War was not an unavoidable natural disaster. It was a man-made catastrophe assembled over decades by a combination of vindictiveness, greed, cowardice, and willful blindness. And its true origins lie not in the invasion of Poland in 1939, but in a cascading series of failures that began the moment the guns fell silent in 1918. So the next time someone tells you that the Second World War started on September 1st, 1939, you can tell them the truth. It started 20 years earlier. It started with a treaty designed to ensure peace that instead guaranteed war. It started with bankers who prioritized profits over stability. It started with politicians who chose appeasement over principle. And it started with a world that looked away again and again until it was too late to look away any longer. History doesn't repeat itself exactly, but it rhymes. And right now, today, if you listen carefully, you can hear some very familiar rhythms. Economic instability, rising nationalism, weakening international institutions, leaders who test boundaries and find no resistance. These patterns are not necessarily confined to history. They're alive and present, playing out across the globe in ways that would be uncomfortably recognizable to anyone who lived through the 1930s. The question is whether we've actually learned anything from the most destructive war in human history, or whether we're simply waiting for the next fuse to finish burning. If this story gave you something to think about, please do consider subscribing to the channel. It genuinely helps more than you might realize, and I'd love to have you along for the next one. I'll see you soon.